everybody. Thank you so much for taking time out of such a busy time of term to join our colloque series today. Just a few quick reminders, if that's okay, for some upcoming events. Remember that we have our very last research series event this Wednesday, when the Political Economy of Pandemics Working Group with David Stettleman and Gustavo are going to be talking about their work and research on that vital topic over the course of the term. And this Friday, thanks to David, we have our wonderful, and Emily and our other wonderful staff, our holiday party, and we're going to be christening the new improved Tocqueville room with some fancy new technology in there that we're going to be using to play Elf, if I'm not mistaken. There will be some delicious holiday cookies as well.
That is
we'll
correct.
Be going from 1 to 3. Sorry,
That
David.
is correct. No, that is
good.
correct.
Good.
If you want to come, send me an email.
Excellent. Yeah, that's right. Remember to RSVP. Hope you can stop by from 1 to 3 on Friday for that and the Wednesday research series event. But we're going to kick things off with Nathan today from a very own O'Neill School at IUPUI. And Jess, maybe you can give a proper introduction. And thanks so much again, everybody.
Sure. Yeah, well, so I wanted to welcome and introduce our speaker today, Nathan Cook, who has been at the O'Neill School at IUPUI for just about a year now, if I'm not mistaken, coming there from the University of Colorado, a place very dear to my heart. And his work is really kind of wonderfully situated in questions of natural resource governance, decentralization, inequality. He's been published in Nature Climate Change, as well as World Development. And I think many of us will recognize both his work and his wonderful co-authors as well. So I'm really looking forward to this discussion. I think it's gonna be wonderful. And with that, maybe I will let him take the stage. I guess just one more point. If people have questions, I'll be moderating the discussion today. It's much easier to keep track of the order of things if people use the chat just to say, I have a question. Also feel free to use the hand raising emoji, but the chat allows me to see the order, which is very helpful. And that means I don't miss anybody. So that'd be great. Anyway, I will let Nathan have the stage. Thanks so much for coming today, Nathan, and looking forward to your talk.
All right, I'll just share my screen here. Can you all see my opening slide? Great. Yep. Thanks, Jess, and thanks for having me and allowing me to be a part of this series this semester, and thanks to you all for tuning in. I know it's a busy time, but I appreciate it. So the work that I'm going to show today is co-authored with some colleagues at the University of Colorado, Purdue, and two organizations in Nepal, and we're really looking forward to hearing your thoughts. So just a quick overview to start us off. The research question that we are interested in exploring in this paper is, what is the impact of natural resource decentralization on social inequality? And so the preliminary finding that we show in the paper, based on this test case of the community forestry program in Nepal that we use as our test case, is that natural resource decentralization programs like the one we talk about here may help to reduce certain social inequalities. So just to give a kind of concrete example of how arrangements like this look for any who might be unfamiliar before I get to the kind of empirics and everything. This is a picture of a meeting of a community forest user group in Nepal. And so this group was created under this country's forestry decentralization reform. And it gives kind of a concrete example, again, of how arrangements like this can look on the ground. So this user group operates kind of like a mini government. So it has authority for managing a forest that people in this village own collectively under the country's forestry decentralization law. It has a locally elected leadership that makes rules about the use and governance of that forest. And if people in this village join this group, they are entitled to certain benefits. They can collect benefits from that commonly held forest, like firewood, which is a very important source of energy for rural people here. Fodder, so feed for cattle, wild foods, and some things that can be sold on the market as well. And they can also get access to cash benefits. So this group raises revenues from the sale of forest products to non-members from outside the village, and those revenues are maintained in a fund, and members of this group can apply to get microloans, scholarships for their kids, and even grants for things like emergency medical expenses from that fund. That's again financed by the revenues that this group raises from the sale of forest products. So groups like this have been established across the country starting in the early 90s when Nepal passed their community forestry law. So this law has been kind of like rolled out in villages across the country since then. And so basically with the stroke of a pen, the government handed over all government-owned forests, which was most forested land in the country at the time, to local communities. And so how that actually works on the ground is government foresters, government bureaucrats go to a village, identify an area of previously government-owned forest, and designate it as that community's community forest, and then work with people in that village to establish a community forest user group, which is a legally recognized official governing body. And it even has a written set of rules, an operational plan, and a constitution, like the one pictured here, that stipulates things like how the group is to be constituted, how membership is to be determined, record keeping, and even things like how the benefits from community forestry should be distributed. And so these written rules are kind of codified in collaboration with those government foresters. So most developing countries have experimented with some kind of decentralization form. Some look more like this, some look a little less like this, but decentralization is common in the common pool resource areas like water, fisheries, forests, pastures. So because reforms like this are so common, we're pretty interested in the distributive aspects of governance arrangements like these. So again, the basic idea is, what is the impact of an arrangement like that on inequality? And so we argue in the paper that we don't know that yet. We do know some things from previous research. One, we know that community forestry and perhaps similar kinds of decentralization can help to alleviate poverty. So for example, there's an analysis by Johan Oldekop and Arun Agarwal and Kate Sims and some other folks from 2018 that suggests that this reform in Nepal probably lowered poverty rates. It probably had a poverty alleviating impact. But we're interested in who benefits most from that effect. So basically disaggregating that effect to understand impacts on inequality. We also know that there's inequality from decentralization. So there's a lot of evidence from a lot of research showing that there is inequality in decentralization. So work from people like Bina Agarwal, for example, showing that it's often not the most marginalized who do the most participating under decentralization and who get the most benefits. The people who participate the most and get the most benefits are often the relatively wealthy rural households. They are often members of the more privileged ethnic groups, and they're often men. So we know that there's inequality under decentralization, but as we talk about in the paper, that's not sufficient evidence to tell us whether that inequality is better or worse than it would be in the absence of decentralization. There may be inequality, but it may be not as bad as it would be in the absence of decentralization, right? So that's what we try to get at in this analysis. And both of these expectations, the better one or the worse one, the expectation that decentralization makes inequality better or that it makes it worse than inequality would be in its absence, both of these expectations have theoretical support, as we talk about in the paper. So let's talk about that really quick. So why might we think that decentralization could lead to less inequality? So this is one of the hypotheses that we set up in the paper, and just to preview the results, this is the hypothesis that we find support for. So as we talk about in the paper, it's important to think about what is there in the absence of decentralization, or in kind of like the pre-decentralization scenario, if you want to think about it that way. So in this country, and probably in some other countries as well, you have government ownership of natural resources that is often just de facto access. So you had a central government that had de jure ownership over forests, but was often simply unable to monitor and enforce those property rights, and probably lacked the local time and place knowledge to manage forests effectively, even if they could monitor what people were doing in the forest. And so what does that lead to? Well, it often leads to something that looks kind of like open access, kind of like an unregulated natural resource. And so there's also often self-organization that pops up in those scenarios. So this is the Ostrom workshop. It's not any surprise to anyone that local resource users often self-organize to govern the commons. We know that. And that was certainly the case in this context. So that user group that I showed a picture of, it may have already existed before the reform. In some villages, people were already doing something that looked like community forestry. They were just kind of doing it informally. They self-organized forest user groups to govern the forest, even if they didn't have formal property rights to do so, right? And so in many places, the community forestry reform established user groups that didn't exist before, but in some other places, it kind of merely formalized user groups that had already existed for quite a while and brought them under some kind of policy framework that stipulated how those user groups needed to operate, right? So why is that important? Well, we know from the work of even workshoppers like Eric Coleman and the late Esther Longi, that self-organized local institutions are often dominated by local elites. Why? Because local elites simply have an advantage when it comes to negotiating the process of institutional formation. And so they're often able to manipulate institutions to their liking, to channel greater benefits to themselves, and hence perhaps less benefits to the marginalized. Now, government involvement through something like decentralization that's done in a formal sense can constrain the power of those local elites. So we often think of decentralization as the granting of autonomy. And of course it is, but it also provides constraints. So that user group that I showed a picture of, to go back to that example again, that user group is not allowed to do whatever it wants. It has that set of governing rules, and those governing rules are written in accordance with government regulations about what user groups can and cannot do, right? So in that sense, decentralization kind of constrains the ways that local elites can manipulate those institutions to their liking, in a way that those elites are not constrained when those institutions are simply self-organized and kind of under the radar, so to speak. So, you know, if we think that that's important, then it's reasonable to expect that there's less of a kind of like unequal benefit flow under decentralization compared to that pre-decentralization scenario, and hence decentralization could generate less inequality. But as we talk about in the paper, it's also not unreasonable to expect that decentralization could lead to more inequality. We don't find this in the paper. We don't find evidence for this second expectation, but we talk about it because it is a reasonable expectation in some ways. So why might it be reasonable to expect that decentralization could lead to more inequality? Well, members of traditionally advantaged social groups have advantages not only when it comes to forming institutions under the kind of pre-decentralization scenario, but they have advantages when it comes to navigating the process of institutional formation under decentralization. So to go back to that example that I showed a picture of, when government foresters showed up to that village to either establish that user group or perhaps formalize it under the community forestry program if it already existed, they likely approached local elites first. Oftentimes local elites are approached first. Why? Because they're seen as gatekeepers. They tend to be oftentimes more literate than everyone else. They tend to be more experienced when it comes to dealing with government bureaucrats. And so they often tend to be either treated as gatekeepers, or at least they have a seat at the table. And oftentimes it's a disproportionate seat at the table due to their literacy and their kind of just general dominance. So it could be then that elites are able to use decentralization as a way to further entrench elite capture. They're able to manipulate the institutions of decentralization so much that they that decentralization actually makes elite capture worse, right? And hence makes inequality worse. So these are the two competing expectations that we talk about in the paper, and then we test them using this case of community forestry. So I already talked about how the reform works and how community forestry works. And this reform that has been rolled out since the early 90s and is still being rolled out in some areas has been rolled out in the context of severe ethnic inequality. So one way of thinking about social inequality in this context is looking at gaps between the Brahmin and Kshetri and Mewar ethnic groups, or the BCN ethnic groups, and kind of everyone else. So the census tracks over 100 distinct ethnic groups, and many of them are Janajati or indigenous ethnic groups. Many of them are Dalit or kind of marginalized Hindu castes, and then there's some other minorities as well. Muslims, Hindu middle castes that live primarily in the southern region of the country, and so forth. And so there are long-standing and visible and well-recognized disparities between the BCN ethnic groups and these minority ethnic groups, basically everyone else. Disparities in terms of human development, so health outcomes, educational attainment, and so forth. Disparities in terms of living standards, wealth, land holding, and even disparities in political representation and participation. So these disparities between the BCN groups and these ethnic minority groups are one way of conceptualizing inequality in this context. And in our study, we kind of measure inequality as the gap between the BCN households and the minority households in the same area. And we look at specifically the gap in poverty, basically. So I'll get into that. So the methodological approach that we use to test or to try to get at whether this decentralization reform has kind of widened or narrowed disparities in poverty between the BCN groups and everyone else relies on data from two sources. So we use data from two censuses in 2001 and 2011, and data from a database of community forest user groups formed under the reform across the country from the time that the reform began in the early 90s. And this database shows when and where each group was established, or formalized, if it was kind of like an already existing group that was formalized under the program. So the causal inference approach that we use relies on two-way fixed effects. So we have within ward fixed effects, and therefore we're making within ward comparisons. The ward is, you could think about that as the smallest official geographic unit. So it's kind of the closest that we can get to the village level using official boundaries that are actually mapped. So we have fixed effects at that level, and then fixed effects at the year level as well. We are doing a household level analysis, which might seem unusual since we're looking at inequality, but hopefully that'll make sense in a moment. The household is our unit of analysis, and for each household, we generate a multidimensional poverty index that we talk about in the paper. It has a health dimension, an education dimension, and a living standards dimension. And so basically, how we can think about this is higher values on this index indicate more deprivations, basically more poverty. And this index is standardized based on 2001 values, so that a 1 unit change is like a 1 standard deviation change in 2001 standard deviation units. So here's the equation for our econometric model. Again, it's household level. So this variable on the left-hand side is the poverty index score for household H. CF, this variable here, is a dummy indicator for whether or not Ward W got its first community forest user group under the reform by year T. So basically it's the policy treatment indicator that turns on when the ward gets its first community forest user group. These three dummy variables here, Dalit, Janajati, and other, are household level ethnicity dummies. So whether or not household age is Dalit, whether they're Janajati, or whether they're other minority household. And then, so, you know, these ethnicity dummies basically capture the average within ward differences in poverty in the absence of community forestry. So they capture social inequality, these disparities in the poverty index within the ward in the absence of community forestry. So Dalit represents, on average, how much poorer are Dalits compared to BCN households in the same ward. And these are, all these three categories are in comparison to BCN households. So those capture disparities. And then, and that's kind of how poverty is measured, or I'm sorry, inequality is measured. And then we interact each of those with the policy treatment indicator. So what these interaction terms capture is the average within ward difference in those ethnic disparities in the presence of community forestry versus in its absence. So how does the presence of community forestry predict a change in those ethnic disparities? And then the obvious things are in the model, this year fixed effect, vector of household level covariates, the ward fixed effects are here, and then the error term, of course. So getting right to the results, we find that the reform appears to reduce inequality between BCN and Dalit and Janajati households. So one way of thinking about the estimates is that in the absence of the community forestry program, the poverty gap is that Dalit households are about 0.4 standard deviations poorer than BCN households in the same ward, and Janajatis are also poorer than BCN households in the same ward, but not by quite as much. So that's very obvious based on what we'd expect from previous studies of inequality in this context. However, our finding is that the presence of community forestry predicts a reduction in this poverty gap for Dalits and Janajatis. Yes, Dalits are poorer than BCN households in the same ward, but they're a little bit less poor in the presence of community forestry. That disparity between Dalits and BCN households in the same ward is not quite as wide in the presence of community forestry, and same for Janajati households. So, you know, we find evidence in support of this hypothesis that decentralization could reduce inequality to some degree. The effect size is not big, but the important thing is that, you know, we don't find that inequality is worse. And remember, there are good reasons to expect that decentralization could widen inequality or deepen it. We don't find any evidence for that, so that's good. Now, we don't find evidence that the reform changes the poverty gap between BCN households and these other minority households. So remember, there's this one other minority category that includes like Muslims and some other ethnic groups, and we don't find any evidence that the reform changes inequality between those groups and the BCN households. So I'll talk in a little bit about why we think that's going on. Here's a way of visualizing those estimates that I just talked about. So on the y-axis represents the difference in the poverty score compared to the BCN groups in the same village for each of these ethnic minority categories. So for example, this red bar here indicates that in the absence of community forestry, because that's red, Dalit households are almost 0.4 standard deviations poorer than BCN households. But look, with community forestry, that gap shrinks, and then we see the same pattern for Janajati households. So those are the effect sizes that I just talked about, but this is just a way to visualize them. So what's going on with this other minority category? We don't see any effect on that kind of inequality, on the inequality as measured by the disparity between BCN households and other minority households living in the same area. So we argue in the paper that this is both obvious, it's like not that surprising, and it's also important that we don't notice this effect for the other priority category. So the language of forestry sector regulations in this country targets benefits from community forestry more explicitly at Dalit and Janajati households than other minority households. So for example, forestry sector regulations say that, as we talk about in the paper, that community forest user groups have the responsibility to provide free or subsidized forest products to Dalit and Janajati households. They don't explicitly say that those groups have to provide those benefits to, say, Muslim households or Terai middle caste households or so forth. So, and there are all kinds of things like that as you go through the forestry sector regulations, where Dalit and Janajati households are specifically named, explicitly called out in ways that some other ethnic minority groups are not. And so we think that this is why we see this effect for Dalits and Janajatis and not others. And so that's important because it suggests that the targeting of these benefits is why we see this inequality reducing effect, apparent effect from this program. And it also suggests that that it's important that reforms like this or policies like this explicitly target benefits and also explicitly designate like who the marginalized groups are who should get those benefits, if we're to see, a positive impact like this. So that's something that we talk about in the paper, and we're looking more into that. So I think now is a good time to wrap up. So I'll open it up for questions and comments now. And again, thank you all for tuning in. I'll end my share.
Great, thanks so much, Nathan. That was a wonderful presentation. I think we have our very first question is from Sally. So we'll let him go first. And just a reminder, I'm keeping the queue in the chat box. And I'll be happy to go after Sally if people are still thinking. So go for it.
So thank you very much. Thank you, Nathan, for a great presentation. So my comment is about how you motivate your research in your paper. You motivate your research agenda on the basis of previous research, which you frame your research as being rigorous, and which in a sense suggests that the previous research was not as rigorous as yours. I think a more effective approach could be to place your research agenda, to put your research question in line with some theoretical debates. I think particularly the formal versus informal institutions framework, you could especially benefit from those debates, because I think your study speaks to that strand of literature. Within Rostrom's framework, rules in use versus rules in form, you have a novel legal framework being implemented. On the one hand, you have potentially case of elite capture. On the other hand, you have rules for producing the outcomes that were intended to produce. So why do you observe this variation after implementation of a legal framework? Why do you observe this variation? And you provide an example actually at the end of your presentation. You indicate that in the code book, in the rules, the legal framework is more clearly defined for certain dominant ethnic groups or groups receiving favorable treatment than others. So does this dynamic explain then why elite capture is harder to occur among these dominant ethnic groups? Or is there a different story about minorities? So thank you very much.
All right. Yeah, thanks. Thanks, Sully. Yeah, I mean, I think your point about how we frame the contribution is well taken. I think the real hook here is, this theoretical tension that you're talking about, and I think that's where we're trying to push the paper. And I mean, yes, we do think that the mechanism behind the patterns that we see has a lot to do with these formal rules that are in the governing guidelines that I talked about. The reason that we see this shrinking gap between Dalits and the ethnic elite, Janajatis and the ethnic elite, has to do with the fact that the formal institutions of community forestry mandate that certain benefits be targeted at those groups. And in the absence of those formal guidelines, why would you ever expect local elites to adopt a policy like that? You wouldn't, right? And so that's the mechanism that we think is going on. Yeah, thank you for your comment.
Brian is next, and then Lavanya.
Okay. Thank you. So it was an interesting paper to read and well done. And I think worth noting, and you could strengthen the context that, in Nepal's community forestry, as far as I understand, is pretty well regarded and pretty effective, and nice to have a study with clear policy implications. That said, for me, the elephant in the room is just reading the paper. You wouldn't know this is a country that went through a civil war with an insurgency that explicitly framed itself in Maoist terms and so on. And more generally, I'm sorry, it's a pet peeve. There's a bunch of development discourse that seems to problematize local elites and not be concerned about national elites, or in your paper, I'm sorry, but kind of assumes they're benevolent and paternalistically improving things. And yes, that's fun, and you have some interesting evidence here, but I think it's worth putting that in a broader context. And I could say more if you're sticking around for some follow-up discussion, but to be more specific here, what did happen in Nepal is the central government lost control of big parts of the country for substantial periods of time, years. And that seems to be one part of the context of what goes on in terms of local contestation. And since I think Krista is still on the call, I'll be provocative. This is like about Peru and not saying anything about Shining Path. To be more constructive, the question is, in terms of further research or analysis, would there be ways to possibly disentangle some more of what's going on in terms of loss of central government control, or even more interesting, contestation within local elites and the way that plays out and interacts with other things? Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Brian. I appreciate that. And you mentioned perhaps sticking around and talking more, and I'd definitely be interested in doing that. Yeah, I mean, you give us a lot to talk about and unpack. And so I'm not sure I'll do it all right now. I mean, one thing that I'll kind of tease everyone with that may relate to some of the things you're talking about is, I think the next step for this project is to look at the politics behind why these provisions for Dalits and Janajatis and not other ethnic groups made it into the policy language in the first place. And so we do think that some of that has to do with broader politics that was going on in the country at the time, like Janajati rights movement, perhaps the history around the Civil War might relate to some of that as well. But we're looking more at kind of like national level politics that might explain why the reform is written in the way it is, especially why benefits are explicitly targeted at, say, Janajatis and Muslims. And that probably does relate to some of the things that you're talking about. And that has to do more, we think, with national level politics and social movements. But yeah, let's talk more about that afterwards if you're interested.
I think Lavanya and then Renzo.
Hi, I'm sorry, my video is not working. So thank you very much for a wonderful presentation. So I have two questions. One is with the way in which you measure the idea of ethnic groups. So basically these are costs that you're talking about, right? And your measure is GDP in terms of how much income is generated in the household. However, if we're thinking of caste is often, I'm talking about it in the Indian context, is measured more in terms of dignity and rights. If I were to take an Ambedkarian idea, or if I were to take Amartya Sen's idea, it would be measured in terms of capabilities. So I was just thinking about just using only income as a category to measure inequality, and in this case, because the ethnic group you're talking about is caste-based. That's my first question. The second question is, I work on forest rights in India, and I had this wonderful natural setting where this road divided the North Forest Division from the South Forest Division. And in one division, you had formal rights, and the other you didn't. But one thing I observed, that when you talk of elite capture, decentralization does not break down patriarchal norms, right? So again, quoting Beena Agarwal, who you all also referred to, gender seems to be something that does not follow this pattern. So I just wanted to put these two things out there. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for all those comments. Those are all really good points. I mean, to your last comment, I don't think that we think that decentralization solves patriarchal gender norms, as you know, and as people like Beena Agarwal show pretty convincingly. That's not something that we look at in this paper, or that I think we even can look at given the data that we have. And you know, we also don't think that decentralization completely breaks down caste norms either. We just think that decentralization might channel benefits to marginalized ethnic groups in a way that we wouldn't expect elites to do in the absence of formal decentralization. Just a quick point. So you mentioned measuring poverty as income. We actually don't measure income in this, and we don't have the capability to do that with these census data. So what we have is essentially a living standards index. So we have 3 dimensions on that index: an education dimension, a health dimension, and a living standards dimension. It's like a poverty index essentially, and these different dimensions contain different deprivations. So the health dimension contains one measure, for example, that indicates whether or not an infant died in that household in the previous year. The education dimension has a dummy variable, for example, that indicates whether or not a school-aged child was out of school in the previous year. And then the living standards dimension includes things like whether or not the household has piped water, for example. So it's much more a measure of living standards than it is income, to get at that question of yours. And then finally, how we measure ethnicity. I mean, ethnicity is a little complicated to measure in Nepal, but we kind of measure it using standard categories that people tend to use. So some of those ethnicity categories are based on Hindu castes. Others are based on designations for Janajati groups. Some of them are like, you know, Sino-Tibetan groups. And so, you know, basically these major categories of you know, Brahmin, Kshetri, Newar, Janajati, Dalit, and so forth are pretty widely used categorizations, and they're based on the over 100 ethnic groups that are measured in the census, many of which are Hindu castes, some of which are not. So I don't know if that answers your questions.
Thank you so much.
Okay, Renzo, and then Krister.
Thank you, Jess. Thank you, Nathan. This is a great presentation, and fascinating to see your work go down to the level of community groups, which is some work that I'm also interested in. So great work there. I have a few questions, but the first one is whether you've been able to see changes in between the 2 time periods you use in the 2 censuses, in terms of how representative the community forest groups are relative to the diversity of the population. So do they have the right amount of members that correlate with the diversity of the ward itself within the community groups? And if you have that, or you have some idea of that, do you think that might be contributing if there's a positive trend toward more diversity within community groups, and that might be affecting the inequality or the changes in poverty that you see in your research? And then Another question that I had was about the supervision that the central government might have about how community groups are being governed and how they are distributing the benefits. So maybe just to get a sense on the mechanisms on how that operates in practice. And then maybe since most of the results seem to resonate to the targeted benefits within these arrangements, whether you've thought about engaging more with conditional transfer literature or literature related to that do target particular types of beneficiaries in terms of what sort of benefits they're going to be receiving in the context of a specific social or poverty reducing program, if that makes sense. So, but thank you. Great work.
Sure. Thanks, Renzo. Thanks for all your comments and questions. Yeah, your first question about how membership has changed in between those two time periods. Unfortunately, that's not something that we have sufficient data to look at least with these data sources. We don't have sufficient data on who the members are to look at something like that. There is some data that the government produced with a big study called 30 Years of Community Forestry that used representative surveys of community forest user groups across the country. And I seem to vaguely remember that one of the findings from that is that membership became more heavily minority representative during that general time period, that like you saw membership becoming less skewed towards more privileged ethnic groups and even more skewed towards Dalits, Janajatis, and so forth this time. But that's not something, I'll think about that. We'll think about that more, but I think that's not something we have the data to really dig into in this study probably. And then, yeah, the conditional transfer literature, I have to say, I don't know a lot about that literature. I'm not an expert in that. So if you were willing to chat for a few minutes afterwards, or if you wanted to connect over email, I'd be very interested in hearing your thoughts on that. And was there a third question that I left out? Or?
Just to get a sense on how the central government actually supervises the groups. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Sorry about that. Yeah. No, that's a great question. So, I mean, a lot of the action when it comes to the government bureaucrats dealing with the local community forest user group, a lot of that action happens at the beginning when that community forest user group is established. So that's the process that I described, where those foresters show up and basically establish the user group and write those guidelines in collaboration with people there. After that, the main action comes when that set of written rules is renewed. So those rules are supposed to expire every 5 to 10 years, and they're supposed to be renewed basically with a revisit that looks like that initial visit, right? So those foresters or other foresters in that office are supposed to come back to the village and either reapprove those rules, or perhaps add to or amend those rules in accordance with new guidelines that the government has passed. And over time, those guidelines have become more stringent when it comes to social inclusion and social justice. Over time, those guidelines have tended to channel more and more benefits to Dalits and Janajatis. So, those written rules are supposed to be reapproved every 5 to 10 years. In reality, they're usually reapproved behind schedule. So the government simply doesn't have enough foresters to do all of that on time. But those groups do get revisited, at least when those approvals are redone. And then if the group wants to do something like apply for approval to establish a forest-based enterprise, or to amend their rules off schedule, maybe they want to collect a new kind of forest product or something like that, add something to that forest management plan or their constitution, that's another time that they have to contact those government foresters. So those are the main times that they interact with government bureaucrats.
if I could just follow up, just
Sure.
so we might be able to rule out the theory that it's the benefits are distributed to the minority groups because the government is continually supervising, but it's mostly happening based on their own community rules on how they're going to distribute and whether they follow up on what the government has established originally. Since supervision doesn't seem to be very often, and they don't have the capacity to do that locally frequently, then that explanation might be ruled out in that case, you think?
Well, I mean, we can't say that government bureaucrats are kind of like stringently monitoring what these groups are doing and if they're following their guidelines. Most of the stringency comes based on like what has to be included in those guidelines, but they simply don't have the capacity to visit the group once every 6 months or once a year to make sure that they're doing these things that they say they're supposed to be doing. And so I think the extent to which the written rules match up with what the groups are actually doing when it comes to distributional questions and equity is a really important thing to explore. And we may not be able to do it with these data, but there are perhaps other data sources that we have where we can explore that. And that's something that I'm very interested in. And as you point out, I think it's very important.
Awesome, thank you.
Sure.
Mr., go ahead.
Thanks, Nathan. Thank you for making us co-authors look so good and smart. So I was thinking, it's more of a comment rather than question, perhaps, but I was thinking, given this finding that the inequality gaps is decreased specifically for just those two minority groups and not for all minority groups, and we link that to the policy explicit targeting. I mean, it may be a couple of things there. It might be worth mentioning how unusual that is in terms of decentralization reform, that minorities are actually singled out and mentioned by name in the policy. I mean, in my study of decentralization, mostly in Latin America, I've never seen that made so explicit. And so how unusual that is in decentralization reforms. So in that case, Nepal is quite progressive again in terms of decentralization reforms, as Brian was commenting on before. So, we might set this up as, if decentralization is to have this type of effect, Nepal is probably the place where we'd look first and expect to see it, and not in many other places. So something about that might be worth mentioning. And then more of a question, I suppose an alternative hypothesis or explanation here might be that, villages or communities where elites have a really firm grip on decision-making and do already benefit disproportionately from forest use, one might argue that those villages or communities are less likely to embrace a program like community foresting, perhaps refuse joining, because they see their benefits diminishing. Kind of an extreme rational choice expectation, perhaps. But explain why I'm wrong and why this analysis, we shouldn't be too concerned with that type of endogeneity of self-selection.
Can I just really quickly add on to that, Nathan, because I had a specific question about that as well, because in a similar context in Senegal, where there's this decentralization of form of community forest groups and forest users, it's up to the communities to decide to opt in. And so you have this really serious, like kind of the flip side of what Krister's talking about, where communities are more likely to potentially do a better job in some sense, right? By nature of some characteristics of the community instead of the actual community forest program or regime that they've opted into. So it's a similar endogeneity question that I was hoping you could sort of unpack a little bit more.
Sure. And so just to be clear, the kind of endogeneity we're concerned about is perhaps these groups don't get formed in the first place, or don't get formalized in the first place in the places that are more unequal. Is that basically the concern? Yeah. I mean, that's not something that I've heard a ton about anecdotally. My suspicion is that it's probably not that common. I mean, there are cases where, for certain political reasons, the process of handing over the community forest, establishing the community forest user group is slowed down or even stopped. But that's often cases where there's some kind of dispute about how people want to use the forest. I'm not sure that it has to do with greater elite capture. Yeah, I'm not sure. I mean, I think we'll have to think about that one. It may be that there's a selection bias issue where perhaps where there's really severe elite capture, elites don't accept the reform, as Krista is talking about, and the handover doesn't happen, or at least doesn't happen as early. I suspect that that's something that we could try to look at with the data that we have. We do have data on how severe inequality is in 2001, and we do have data on where groups were formed or established after 2001. So it may be possible to examine this question of whether that kind of selection bias is occurring, but I'd have to think more about that. I think it's an important question.
So a corollary of that, and then I think Jamie has a question, is about whether you can tell the duration. So for instance, you say like it's sort of whether there's a community forest user group after 2001 or not, you know, like, right, it's, you don't have a how long it's been in place question, at least from what I can tell. And so one thought is like, some of these effects you might wish to see might take some time, but also if enforcement is somewhat lax, as Renzo was asking about, right? Is it the case that you might even have regions that have entrenched elites that were not super wild about adopting these formal regulations, but have enough pull not to be able to really strongly enforce them, even if they do adopt them, right? So that like, let's say they adopt them, but either they don't, either it takes some time for them to work, right? Or you have a strong enough elite population local area that they have these legal, like formal forest management plans in place, but there are ways of circumventing their effectiveness or implementation as a result. So in other words, I would love to know if you have any baseline understanding of level of elite entrenchment. I don't know how you could do that, right? At the time of forest management adoption, forest user group property rights regime adoption.
Yeah, I mean, unfortunately not. It would be great if we did have that, because it would open up all kinds of interesting things that we could do. I mean, you know, when it comes to inequality, pretty much what we can measure using the data that we have here is local inequalities between the elite ethnic groups and everyone else in terms of, you know, things like economic status, this poverty index in 2001 and 2011. And then, I mean, with the forest user groups that we have in the data, we pretty much have when they're established, where they're established, and when those plans were updated, if they ever were, which for some, they weren't updated by the time the data set was built at all. So we can't unfortunately get at this question of like, are some of these groups being established, but elites are kind of doing whatever they want anyway? Like, to what extent is the group actually like a meaningful institution in that place? That's not something that we can really get at with this data, unfortunately. But those are all things that I'm going to think about, and I think we're going to talk about, and maybe see if we can get at those using other data sources.
Okay, I have an interesting idea. We'll leave that to the later Q&A session after everyone's had a chance to go, because I want to talk with you about something. But I think Jamie had a question, and then we'll see where we're at.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. I think it's really fascinating to use censuses to try and get, you know, to get a sense of what's going on in your study. Censuses also leave so much out too. And I was wondering, are you guys planning fieldwork at some point to talk to these minority groups to find out how they perceive themselves rather than relying on the national data that you have at hand? And also, I would be curious too. So we're defining equity. Is that even by Western terms and Western definitions, or is it by Nepalese terms and definitions? So, thanks.
Sure. Thanks, Jamie. Both great questions. On your first question, we just completed a round of field work this year. It was slowed down a little bit due to COVID, of course, where we ran a survey in 100 villages, and we're going to do a follow-up survey next year. That starts next year, and our survey is really geared towards the kinds of questions that we're asking in this study. So questions of equity, participation, equality. And so we're interviewing people about how they participate in the user group, about how they, asking them to evaluate the user group along different dimensions like benefit sharing and so forth. And we're running a series of kind of vignette type survey experiments in this baseline survey. And the purpose of those experiments is to understand the importance of these different targeted benefits that I talked about, like microloans and things like that, for specifically how, excuse me, marginalized households, Dalit households, Janajati households, female-headed households, and so forth, evaluate whether or not they want to participate in the group or not. And so I would say, yeah, we're doing stuff in the field right now that's geared towards exactly those kinds of questions that you raised. Unfortunately, I can't talk about any results yet because we don't have them yet. The data are just coming in, but that's where we're going next, is more in-depth data collection focused on those kinds of things. And then your second question, to what extent does the way that we measure equality match up with how people in this context think about equality? I mean, some of the authors on this paper are Nepali, and I mean, there's never agreement on what equality or equity is and how it should be measured, right? We'll just say that. But this is not an uncommon way of thinking about what inequality is in this context. I mean, these are the reason that Dalits and Janajatis are named in these guidelines is because those are politically salient categories, is because there's a recognition that these groups have been marginalized for a long time. And so, there are other types of inequality that we're not capturing, like gender-based inequalities, as Lavanya mentioned. Of course, there are things that are left out in this analysis, but the way that we measure inequality is pretty consistent with one way that people conceptualize it in this context. And by people, I mean, Nepali scholars and how equality is discussed in politics in Nepal. Thanks.
Okay, well, we are really close to 1 o'clock. I don't know if anybody has any final questions, but if not, perhaps Nathan, you could, if you have any final concluding remarks, there will be the opportunity for those of you that are interested to hang around. Nathan, I hope I mentioned, but I may have forgotten. We would love for you to stick around for maybe 15 minutes or so to continue the conversation if you're available. But otherwise, if you have some concluding remarks for those of the folks that have to leave at 1. And then the rest of us will hang around.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just say again, thanks everyone for attending. You all have given me a lot to think about. I have 2 pages of notes here, so I really appreciate the input and the questions. And I will hang around for anyone who wants to still chat. Looking forward to that.
Great, thanks.